Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, your regular host. And for those joining us on Spotify and YouTube, you realise that we now have video with the podcast. So if you're not on those platforms, jump across so you can watch along as we go through some of the heavy hitting content that we've got planned. I want to acknowledge the efforts of Captain Lyndon Harvey at Headquarters Jock for setting up all the video and making it look awesome. But I suppose that leads into jumping into today's episode, which is on training systems and how to get after the most effective training. My two guests, I've got Training Warrant Officer Army, Warrant Officer Class 1 Mick Reyne. He's instructed soldiers at 1 RTB, training officers at RMC Duntroon, and those deploying on individual deployments at 39 OSB. He was the RSM of 1 hour. My second guest is Warrant Officer Class 1 Brad Doyle. He's the current Command Sergeant Major of Forces Command. He's formerly the RSM of the Combat Training Centre. He's also, and where we first met, has been the RSM of the 1st Brigade up in Darwin. And he's held a number of instructional appointments across his career. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. So I suppose RSM straight off the bat, before we go into training systems and how we train, I want to come back a little bit. There's been a number of changes at Forces Command over the last couple of years in particular. Can you just go through the state of play for Forces Command now, what you've lost and what you gained, and the structure, I suppose, but more importantly, if we zoom out a little bit, the role of Forces Command now?
Yeah, certainly. So Army went through a significant restructure after the Defence Strategic Review and the National Defence Strategy, and the implementation of moving the combat power into the two deployable divisions, and having the division as the unit of action is the main structural change. Forces Command has now restructured into being the land domain training, or responsible for the land domain training system. The only part of combat power that Forces Command currently has is the 2nd Health Brigade, because the 2nd Health Brigade services both the divisions. But predominantly the change has been now that Forces Command's responsibility for the land domain training system means that it has and as the Army G7, it now has a responsibility to have an observation and implementation of training across all three environments of individual, collective and advanced collective and joint collective training.
So that's like, I suppose, what used to be Training Command, which was just initial training basically, is now, I suppose, Forces Command is more encompassing across the entire continuum. Is that like boiled down to roughly, is that roughly what it's like now? Yeah,
so certainly people have a very shallow view that we should just change Forces Command's name back to Training Command, but Training Command was never responsible for the full gamut of training across the three domains. It was only ever responsible for individual training. It was disconnected from the other training systems. So what the Chief of Army has implemented now in the land domain training system has now unified all of the training systems, less the aviation and special operations training, so that Forces Command is now responsible for all of the inception of a skill right through until it's able to be exercised at an expert level.
Yeah, cool. And I suppose if we talk about that in practice, what examples have you seen going from initial training and then all the way to the advanced collective? How's that feedback loop? How have you seen it in play now that the restructure and that you own that full continuum?
Yeah, so the Battle Lab is instrumental in that. And the Combat Training Centre has now also been moved out of the 1st Division into Forces Command. So they work in unison, where the Combat Training Centre is invariably responsible for the delivery of advanced collective training. And to understand what advanced collective training is, if you think of it through a very simple lens, individual training is instructed training to a point where you get to a standard where you can be employed then into a collective environment. That collective environment is actually designed, developed and implemented by yourselves in unit and formation level. Advanced collective training is where the environment is created for the immersion of the force, whether it be unit, formation, division, into an environment where they can't replicate themselves, but they can exercise within that environment.
I think that like a more recent critique, and we talked about it off episode as well, was that like when we talk about that step between individual to collective, a lot of people dwell on the fact that individual training is becoming less so. I mean, we're going through trials. RMC is currently only doing a trial, and it's obviously been shortened, the initial training and that individual skill. So if we talk about that individual skill being reduced, or the level of which the soldiers and officers are coming out being reduced, and then going into units, like some would argue a liability, I suppose, how do they pick up, what's the plan with picking up the slack on the collective stuff after the individual?
Yeah, so this is where I think it's important to understand what the training of a skill entails. So if we look at it through a very simple lens of a skill being from unskilled through developing into competent, which is qualified usually in the same area, and then into proficient and expert. The environments in which we are able to take a skill from unskilled through to competent is generally under instruction, under supervision, and then to a point where they can exercise that skill to a standard where they can be employed safely in the workplace, still under supervision. That's the transition point of the general transition point of the individual into collective training. So they have been deemed competent, able to perform the skill. They then practice the skill in the environment that the skill is going to be employed in, with others generally practicing the same skill, supervised by commanders, to a point where they become proficient. Proficient is generally where the skill is then no longer required to be supervised, and they can continue practicing that skill to become expert.
Yeah, and just to reinforce on that points that were made about supervision, at certain points, especially in the individual, you are being built up to a level of competence, and there is levels of competence that we know about, but I talk about the point here of conscious competence. You've got the ability to get yourself to complete a certain task. You still got to think about it, and you may need assistance as you do so. The other aspect to can also consider in this discussion is the fact that this is not the first time we have had reduced training periods in our individual training continuum. And I'll use Kapuka as an example. For instance, when we were both posted there in 99, 2000 sort of time frame, 2000, 2001, recruit training was 6 weeks. It was modularised, and it was a common induction course which catered for both elements of our force as we went along. However, in that very short but extensive period of time, when I talk about that, is in the analysis that was conducted about what was essential versus very important and or desirable had been done. And the product that we'd released at the end of that 6 weeks of training had them at a very good level to move, shoot, communicate and medicate, in broad terms. But if we break that down just into one specific discipline, for instance, they achieved stage 2 elementary application of fire on 2 weapon systems that are used across the foundation continuum, being the LSW and the individual rifle at the time. So if we look at that in isolation, there was very good use of 6 weeks of training to produce the foundation skills required for you then move on into your IET, which would then put you in a different team environment and then broadly build the foundation for you to move into collective.
Okay, cool. I think that's an awesome point to pick it back up on, because you're talking about, desirables or necessary, all that sort of stuff in the training, and going through that analysis. I suppose the Chief of Army talks about must do, should do, and could do, this sort of continuum of those things that we include at each training part in training. If we come back to doing that analysis, which you just talked about the importance of it before, how do we analyse training, going back to you, RSM, how do we analyse the training that we're going to deliver, noting that we are short on time, we have to do more collective training, and we really need to get big bang for buck training outcomes when we conduct any of this training?
Yes, so we have a tool that was implemented in 1953, which was at the time called the Systems Approach to Defence Training, and it was then renamed the Systems Approach to Defence Learning. There are 5 steps to the Systems Approach to Defence Learning, and they are analyse, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. The first step of that tool is where we should be understanding what is needed to be trained, and then in what manner would be best undertaken. The Systems Approach to Defence Learning is a mechanism that has been given to us to use. It is also directed in joint doctrine that we are to use it in the collective environment. However, we've never nested any of our doctrine with the understanding of how to implement the Systems Approach to Defence Learning into collective training. The thing I think that is most important in answer to your question with the analyse phase of a training iteration is where you'll understand what is the state of your force able to undertake whatever is the outcome that you're trying to achieve. In layman's terms, for example, if a company is going to do an area of operation clearance activity as a collective training event, a platoon commander should then be able to analyse in their training prior to undertaking that training event what are the things that are required. They're going to need to go from point A to point B. They're going to need to understand how to maintain protection at the hull. They're going to need to know how to do clearance activities. So in real layman terms, move from here to there, you need to be able to navigate. So the platoon commander would need to understand what is the level of the orders, the standard of the section commanders, the platoon sergeant, the section members' ability to navigate. If they have a very low state of their ability to navigate from point A to point B, apply bearings, read a map, read a compass, march on a bearing, then they may even need to go back and do individual training. So retrain that skill prior to undertaking any collective training activity before they even move into the activity they're going to do as a collective group, as a company or as a combat team. So these are the analyse phase will determine what it is you need to do, all the things that are associated with the learning for the outcome before you even get into the design of then how it is you're going to undertake it, develop what's the environment that's going to be undertaken in, and what is the mechanisms that are going to support those activities, and then the implementation of it. Where are you phasing in observation, feedback for intervention? Because if you're if you're training a skill or you're practicing a skill and no one's observing it and giving feedback, then what's the point of doing it?
Yeah,
You're doing it totally wrong.
If a tree falls in the woods, no one's there to hear it. It's like, yeah.
But also you could be practicing something really well, really badly. So you could be becoming really good at being bad at something.
Yeah.
And so if you aren't understanding where are those points where it can be observed in feedback for intervention for improvement, because this is all about continual improvement. That this model is designed to provide you the opportunity to constantly improve. Because when you've done the implementation, then you need to evaluate what you've done, and the evaluation will then inform the next iteration of analyse. So it's a never-ending circle or cycle that allows you to improve, to performance improve. Because at the end of the day, if we do an activity and our outcome isn't to get better at it, then why are we even doing it?
Yeah, and that's like what I said before in terms of it's a zero-sum game. You have to be doing good training, otherwise you're not doing good training. Do you know what I mean? It's every opportunity you have to use it. Yeah. Come back to the analysis stuff. So there's a distinction there you made between what is my likely task, same as an appreciation process. You're looking at likely tasks. These, you might need to you occupy a support by fire location and you need fire control measures, okay? So like all those sorts of things. The next step, I suppose, still in the analysis is where are we at? Is that what you're basically saying? Is like, what do we need to do and where roughly are we at before we even move into the design of the training? I suppose back to you, Warrant Reyne, can you just talk through an example of where analysis has worked or hasn't worked in the past in that step there?
So the point that was raised there is about the start state. And sometimes if you've got a corrupted start state where you believe that your force is at a particular standard, okay, before you begin, unfortunately, as you then move past your analysis into your design and develop, that corrupted start state is already now going to weave itself across the activity because you weren't at that particular point from the start. So, and we may say that a really good example there is we spoke about briefly navigation. We believe our troops are at a standard where they can apply the fundamentals of preparing a navigational data sheet, can apply, or use a compass effectively, their own individual skills in relation to reading a map, paces, maintaining a bearing and so on. Straight away, if we have not actually identified that in our analysis phase to see where our start state is, which will inform us that we need to go back. And again, that
probably
builds
much better
upon
than we thought. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so they are the exact, or that is an example of where even before we've started through the next steps, we've already got, to use that term, corrupted data, which unfortunately is going to lead us to poor design, development, and even measure of effectiveness. A big point that falls out of when we talk about measuring the effectiveness is against what criteria did we want? from there as well. Do we want, and so that's about talking about, you've got the environment. Now it might be close country, in this particular case, and that will impact on some of the geographic locations of our units, because if we give a very broad brush, a soldier must be able to navigate by day a minimum of 1,200 metres, in a single bound. Okay, that sort of business. Well, that might take several hours in close country in a certain environment.
Yeah.
All right. So sometimes, as they've moved past their individual and they've moved into their collective training environment, but where they are now revising those skills, it will also be environmentally based, and the analysis will also inform us of how we can best utilise our time, if that makes sense so far.
And in support of that, we need to understand as well, as we spoke about earlier, the life cycle of a skill, for example. If we are deemed competent at something and we don't then practice it again for a prolonged period of time, it will degrade back to developing or back to unskilled. So there may be the requirement to reteach under instruction, the individual training, actually in the collective environment, reteach skills that have got to a point where they've faded so badly that they're now back at the untrained level.
Yeah, I think that's that point about like going from the analysis, and then there must be a tendency to jump straight to develop, and skip the design component of the training. And this is basically taking a more deliberate approach to deliver incredibly effective training. So talking about the WETS example before, like if you jump from analysis straight to develop, you go to so I'm going to pull it down to a section commander level, but he or her has identified what he needs to get to, he or she needs to get to on a shoot, goes up to the OIC or the WETS operator, and says, what predetermined shoots have you already got? Let's run one of them, and I hope that it achieves the outcome that I set out. Can we, instead of skipping that design phase of the continuous improvement sort of life cycle, can we talk about how to go about designing and taking a deliberate pause to get after that component?
So there's two aspects to that, and I'll just rewind just slightly. When we're talking about identifying the standard of our troops, as in getting some data, a simple tool like an exercise trained soldier can give us a baseline of where we can now move into, okay, we've got some data here, I can use that in the analysis and we can move on. But switching back to targets, back into the employment of the WETS facility for a particular training event that's not necessarily just as a technical trainer, but as a tactical trainer. The point you raised there is if a section commander wants to exercise and train a certain outcome within there, again, he has done or her have done their analysis, and what they do is they book time with the WETS operator to design their activity to meet their criteria for measure of effectiveness and so on. Yeah, and that's a bit of a missing X factor that comes in preparation for the training event itself, and noting the fact that, again, as you've indicated, not being led down the training path by an already pre-existing scenario that may not be suitable, but you're going to try and massage into it. Actually take the time, which is very valuable at this particular point, to design. So you've analysed what you want, bring into that design phase of exactly the activity and the environment in which you now want to train in, and collect that data to see whether you've met that criteria. So I trust that assists.
In basic terms, the design is the plan. What's the plan of what you are going to achieve?
Look, I want to come back to the simulation component, because there's a tendency, I talked about a tendency to skip design and go straight to develop and then implement, basically. Sometimes just skip the whole thing, go straight to implement. You haven't actually thought about what you want to achieve and how you're going to go about it. There's also a tendency to use always use physical stuff. All right, let's get down in the scrub and I want you to shake out and we're going to do it like this. There are a significant number of different tools that we probably underutilise. We know we don't use simulation enough. Some of the other, and simulation is way broader than what we're just the WETS, for example. We've got a Chinook pilot on, and they talked about auto rotation when they lose both engines on the Chinook and it starts to fall. By using the pitch of the blades, they can slow the descent of the aircraft. And I asked the Chinook pilot, I said, like, how often do you do that in the aircraft? And they're like, never. We only ever do it in simulation because it is hell to do it in the aircraft. But so come back, let's talk about, we're going through the design and getting up to the development phase, and we're looking at our options for training. What are they? Like, what should we be using to get after? Not just the kinetic stuff like shaking out, doing old school stuff, but like what can we get after now?
So at that point, I'll focus on just two quick examples. First one is basic paracourse, right? And all of the training continuum to get you to that first descent of which you must be consciously competent. You have to be, because you're the only person who is going to pull the reserve handle if there is a malfunction at that stage. So the training prior to that, which has a number of different training aids to assist flying foxes, a large tower or a high tower that raises you above the ground, gets you to a point where you have now been trained and assessed to get to conscious competence, ready for that first live descent, not last. Okay. Now that same example can actually be put across many of our disciplines, but we don't think of it that way, about building that level of conscious competence before we even get there. And the reason I raise about the point conscious competence is because then our supervisory requirements lessen immediately, because if they are consciously competent, whilst they've still got to think about the skill to apply it, the supervision is less. Now, if we take that to somebody who's designed an activity and they just want to focus on the ability to conduct a full mission profile, for instance, of an ambush, utilising the WETs as a tactical training tool to assist in this. So they've done their orders. Those orders have now been compiled by the section commanders to give for a section ambush event to be conducted. Those orders, for instance, can be done outside the WETs, being validated by the platoon commander, platoon sergeant, or a peer assessment, whichever is necessary at this stage, or whichever assists. And then they can actually go and apply the physical inside the WETs, go into the WETs, occupy, set, spring, reinitiate if necessary, search and withdraw, all in the WETs. From that particular point, whilst they've done it in simulation, which also provides additional feedback in relation to accuracy, ammunition usage and so on, they've done time and space effects. Now what we can do is, and I'll just pause on one point there, they can also use a lot of their other effects, night vision equipment, radio communications and so on. But from that particular point, they can then push out into a field environment and now take it away from that good learning environment that's atmospherically controlled, as well, into a field environment and run through another number of iterations by day and by night to validate that as well. So that's probably a good example, or an example anyway, of the use of simulation in our tactical training.
Yeah. And before you go live for the first time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I suppose that's design, the options for developing the training and stuff. If we talk about the implementation, it seems like to a cold reader, having not been exposed to great detail, I'm on the military instructor course at the minute, but I have only just been exposed to it. But if we talk about the implementation, that seems like the easy bit, like from a cold reader. Is it? Or what are your thoughts on, what are the considerations around implementing the actual training now that you've gone through a deliberate process to get there?
So what I would say to that, sir, is the implement is the easy bit when you haven't done the first three steps, because the first three steps will inform how difficult the implement actually is, because the implement is where you need to not only practice it, but you need to get feedback on it. And that's where the feedback will determine whether you are able to achieve the level that you set out to or not, because then the evaluate will then, like I said before, inform the next cycle.
Yeah.
If you go from this is the activities we are going to undertake and get straight into the implementation without any of the design or development phases, you'll almost certainly find it easy to do, but you probably won't have a good outcome.
Yeah. So like way easier in execution, but does not achieve the effect because you didn't do any analysis, and we just keep reinforcing failure, I suppose. Well, not failure, but poor learning outcomes.
Yeah. And it's really difficult to get any performance above baseline.
Yeah.
Because we're, as I said, if we were consciously practicing skills with always the outcome in mind to improve, and we would then have an understanding, as Mick said earlier, you would then have a criteria as to what that. So we are currently at this level. What is the criteria that we can then assess against to take us to the next level? And I would challenge, people out there in the wider army. When was the last time you actually asked yourself that? We're going to undertake this activity. This is the level we are currently at. I now need to create criteria that I can measure against with observation and feedback to tell me whether I did or didn't achieve it.
Absolutely. And as we talk about what also needs to be considered in the implement is there's the resourcing requirements, there is any policy and or safety architecture and so on. That all comes out as well. So not just focusing on the outcomes of the training, but also the training enablers are all identified. Okay, and that means we don't miss steps along the way because obviously that's when good times go bad. Yeah. But the other point that falls about, I just use a simple example of, again, the full spectrum. If we talk about shooting, just as an example, something near and dear to my heart, so some people in the background probably already thinking that, but in any case, a shooting continuum, though, isn't just made up of the employment of the weapon system and or the ranges and targetry, but it's also your ability to provide or display and or accurately conduct fieldcraft, target detection and so on within that. So right now, if we just look at a good continuum, which allows our people to produce an operational capability effect at the end, it's not just about just the weapons and the range and the ammunition. It's actually interweaved within that is their fieldcraft, target detection, employment of the systems, whilst displaying combat behaviours, survivability and lethality. So a few other considerations as well.
If we go from, so implementation, easy bit if you haven't actually done the design and the analysis and stuff behind it, but more difficult when you have because you've set a good list of criteria that you're trying to tick off and get some really good training outcomes. How do we do evaluation though? So, and how it's difficult for people to have someone come in. We have coaches and certain people come in to training outcomes and they it's difficult for us to take feedback from them or we feel like we're under threat or something. How do you go about the evaluation component? Not just yourself, but is third party, is it good to have someone come in and do that or how do we get after it?
Well, I think almost certainly that third party is the preferred because it's going to be a unvarnished feedback. But as Mick said with the ambush at the wets scenario, peer assessment is a really valuable tool.
Vicious sometimes, but valuable. Yeah. Well,
if you've ever sat in a debrief in the Air Force on their policy debrief, they have another example is surgeons. They have peer assessment, and they can be brutal. But that brutal feedback is what sometimes you are needed because if you do that same activity like you just did it, like say a surgeon, if you do that again like you did it with that poor feedback, someone could die because of it. And so, I think we need to, perhaps be a little bruiseless in our ability to take feedback. But, peer assessment is a really, really valuable tool because the person who's assessing you is learning from you as well. That person is learning, I probably wouldn't do that like that next time. Maybe I would have, but if I saw, now that I've had the opportunity to see this first, I won't do it like that. Or, wow, I wouldn't have done it like that, but I'm really going to try and do it like that for my people because that was done really, really well. So, the ability to get one another's peers to assist us in these journeys, I think is underutilised. I don't think we use it enough. I think we certainly have the ability to do that. I think if we're honest about it, we choose not to.
Yeah.
Because
we shelter ourselves from it because we don't want to be bruised, to use your words before.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is, I suppose getting people to, I suppose it's that coaching someone or it's convincing someone to come and evaluate, despite the fact they have competing demands themselves. But that point that you made before, which is you are likely to learn a lot from this as well, having not have to go through it yourself. And you may be able to acknowledge that I probably would have done the same thing, genuinely. That's me being honest. But now I know that that's not the case. I think selling it to someone else to be come and watch me do this and evaluate how I go and give me some really good feedback and have a tough conversation. It doesn't need to be in front of the whole section. As a section commander, if we're talking about section command doing the wrong thing or something that's not ideal, but definitely have those tough conversations. Yeah.
So that point you raised there, sometimes an open forum for an error that has occurred makes the short learning loop so much shorter immediately. But it's about the point of flipping the narrative. Yeah, yes, there was an error. Let's focus on, okay, what did the person do right? Yes, there was that one error. How have we learnt from that? And then we continue on with the next part of the activity, noting that everyone in that particular small group now will more than likely be aware of some of the actions that the member did that led to the error. And that means you've just closed that short learning loop very rapidly. There's other mechanisms for collection. A weapon handling test in alone, and as an individual, is a evidence collection of and evaluates how the learning has gone. So, that's from little to CTC observations and collection plans linked to certain activities or tactical actions that are occurring during a collective activity. And as we collect against those, obviously that will then inform our full spectrum of data points within the evaluation, and leading to that deeper, right, is there trends? And those trends can then be fed back into the analyse and who is most responsible to essentially affect those trends with a different style of training, retraining, or what's necessary from that particular point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sorry, I see.
We have a hierarchical structure. That's how Army is structured. We have a responsibility to train one level down, observe 2 levels down. So anybody who is in a command appointment has a responsibility to observe and provide feedback and intervention for improvement at every level.
Yeah.
And that links to coaching and mentoring. I don't think I know anyone who's in a chain of command and or holds particular responsibilities and appointments who doesn't want to then generate a better person at the next rank down or rank further down along the way in the journey, because that's all part of that coaching and mentoring to constantly improve and give someone the opportunities to excel. And it's the mark of all of our good instructors that really we want to instruct to the point where that student is actually excelling at a better standard.
Absolutely. Yeah. But one thing you said before was that it's commanders' responsibility, and not just commanders, but like 1 up, 2 up. It's their responsibility to train the soldiers underneath them. I suppose it's also, we talked about how deliberate you need to be with your analysis and design. I suppose the idea, they need to cut out time in the start of a training year to actually get after a deliberate approach to this as well. There's going to be a tendency, I suppose, to get straight into stuff and get out into the training areas. It's easy in Darwin where we just come from because it's flooded until the end of March or whatever it is. But so I think, would you also argue, I suppose, it's my argument, I suppose I'm just pushing it on you now, but would you also argue you need to give your secos time to actually go through and conduct some analysis rather than just launch into, my PER says I need to do this, I'm going to start ticking these things off. Do you know what I mean? Take a more deliberate approach.
So in answer to your question, I'll counter question.
Yeah.
Would we have a different approach to training if our training year went from, let's say, Talisman Sabre, from August to July?
Yeah.
Would
definitely.
we have a different approach? We currently go from February to November.
Yeah.
And we get to a certain level of training generally at November. We then have a break. We come back. And as you just said, we get back into, let's go back to the basics. What has caused us to go from where we were in November to then
back to
let's go back to square one like we did last year?
Yeah.
Is that because of we're not disciplined in the way we have understood the saddle and understood what is the training level we've achieved here? Let's change a few staff is generally what the posting cycle changes command and sport to command appointments generally. Less than 20% of a unit normally. 80% of that unit was there last year at that training level that they got to. Why wouldn't we just do an analysis of where we are now after a 4 to 6 week break, and then commence after doing the analyse phase of the saddle, commence from there, from where we were? That would then negate the need. Let's just carve out this time for section commanders to go into this. Let's carve out this time for section commanders to train on those things. They actually have a start state already that they've achieved. But the assumption is that we've got to go back to basics.
Yeah.
Well, the basics should be, what are the things that we have now, what have we not been able to continue to do during the break? Let's give time for that only, and let's continue on back in the saddle, not this saddle, but the saddle on the horse. Let's get back on the horse and keep riding at the same rate we were riding last year, which we don't. We actually go back to the start that we were last year. And this is the frustration of the soldiers, that they get back to the start all over again. Where we should have a more mature approach to it, that this is where we got to, so this is kind of where our start state should be for next year. Because what that then enables is continual performance improvement. We're actually then each year going to get better and better and better than where we were last year.
There's probably 3 points on that, and it sort of links to this question and the previous as well. when we look at where our force is at, so I marched into 1 RAR as the RSM, and within 6 weeks we were on a battle group warfighter. So a very limited period of time for myself to prepare myself, because I had to upskill myself to a degree. The CO marched in at the same time.
Yeah.
Who's currently the Brigade Commander 3 Brigade.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we had to have the aspect of where is our force at? Where are they at right now? Because, and they're at that 80%, but I may have some new CSMs and so on, and there may be some skills or phases that are required that I need to inject my advice and the training mechanism. So straight away we need to, this is analysing what we need, but also what my force needs and how I upskill those CSMs or align. Probably not upskilling is not the best word in this particular case, but align those CSMs with the effect we want to achieve. The other element that falls out of that as well is when we look at supporting elements. So in our evaluation, and we've already mentioned such things before as an exercise trained soldier. Now we can basically, as long as we've got the ability to coordinate and effectively achieve that with a collection plan, that will inform our analysis on where we need to move in certain areas. The other one is something as simple as a competency logbook insert. Are there certain disciplines or skills that are meant to be signed off in a certain period of time that we've actually identify all those, put them on a big whatever mechanism you use, there's a training program. But now I've got to do the deeper to say, right, analyse what it is. Some of those will be given to us out of doctrine. Others we're going to have to design ourselves. And how do we interweave that, if that's the best way to best use of time, interweave that within the training we're already doing to achieve those outcomes?
And I think aligned with what Mick's saying, with regard to training, if it is not nested with the Army order or combat behaviours, why are you doing it?
Yeah.
The Chief of Army has been very explicit in his order. The must, should, could do. If it doesn't fall into any of those categories, then never do it again. And if it's a could do or should do you have time, or are you not achieving the must dos? I think it's, and I'd encourage any commander to look. I'd encourage any commander to read the Army order for starters, because it's pretty specific. It's pretty prescriptive as to what you are to achieve. But it will guide, it'll give you the handrail as to what is needed for the force employment.
I think that's an awesome point to leave with, is like get after the things that you've been directed to get after and start doing it in a way, putting it through some sort of tool. We've just presented the one you should definitely use. But I suppose what we went through was training, how to get into that collective training space, but through the ADDIE cycle, which is analyse, design, develop, implement and evaluate, and that continuous loop coming back to an analysis after you've evaluated your last training, being very deliberate with everything you do. Thank you both so much for your time to get, I suppose, those that are best equipped to inform us about training. It's been absolutely awesome.
Thank you, sir. And I think it's important for us to understand that collective training is the responsibility of the force. It's the only part that they can and should be getting after, and that's where their main effort should always be, in the collective training space.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Knowledge dispels fear.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.